Eleanor Ashford had not slept properly in 3 nights. By the morning Edmund Hartwell was due to arrive at her family's estate. The sleeplessness had turned into something with weight to it, something she carried in the tightness behind her eyes, and the careful way she moved through the early morning rooms. She dressed herself before Nell arrived, standing in the cold pre-dawn light of her bedroom, with only the small candle on the writing desk for company, and she went to the window afterward, and stood there with her palm against the cold glass, and watched the empty drive below. Nothing moved. The November frost had come down hard overnight, and covered everything in pale, sharp stillness. She watched it for a long time, and allowed herself, privately, and without any audience to perform for, to feel what she actually felt. She was afraid. Not in any loud or helpless way. Eleanor was not a loud or helpless person, but in the honest, quiet way of someone who has looked at a situation clearly and understood that it carries real stakes. She was 23 years old, and she was about to meet the man she was going to marry, and everything she had learned about Edmund Hartwell in the 3 weeks since her father had sat her down in the study and explained the arrangement told her the same thing. He was courteous. He was capable. He was, by every account she had gathered from every drawing room and parlor she had visited, a man who had decided, cleanly and without apparent regret, that love was no longer something he was able to offer. His wife Catherine had died 4 years ago, from a fever that arrived without warning and left without her, and something in Edmund had closed permanently with her. Women said it in hushed voices that were also, strangely, admiring. They said it as though it settled the matter. Edmund Hartwell's heart died with his wife, and the rest of him simply kept walking. Eleanor had spent 3 weeks trying to be practical about this. She was good at being practical. It was one of the things she was genuinely good at, alongside running difficult meetings, managing household crises, and reading people with an accuracy that occasionally made them uncomfortable. But practicality had its limits, and one of its limits was the part of her that had always, quietly and without making demands about it, wanted something real from the marriage she would eventually have. Not something theatrical, not something overwhelming, just something genuine. Something that had warmth and honesty and real regard somewhere at its center. She had told herself for 3 weeks that she could manage without this. She was no longer entirely sure. Nell knocked at 7, and the day began assembling itself around her. Clara came to her room at 8:30, as Clara always came, without waiting for the knock to be answered, and sat at the end of Eleanor's bed, with the expression of someone who had been holding something in since the previous evening. Clara was 17, and she had spent 3 weeks conducting what she called research into Edmund Hartwell, which meant she had spoken to everyone available who had any connection to him, and had compiled their accounts into a detailed mental portrait that she found enormously interesting. Clara was the kind of person who found most things enormously interesting, which Eleanor considered one of her more useful qualities. Harriet Finch's older sister was at a dinner in the county 2 seasons ago, where Edmund was present, Clara said, settling comfortably against the bedpost. She said he was the quietest person at the table, and had the clearest eyes she had ever seen on a person. She said when he looked at you, you felt as though he was reading something you had not meant to show. Harriet's sister attends too many dinners, Eleanor said. She does, Clara agreed, entirely undisturbed. But she is also observant. She told me something else as well. She paused in the way of someone who understood the pause was effective. She said that the host's youngest child fell and hurt herself badly on the terrace during the dessert course, and before the nurses had managed to find the child, Edmund had already carried her inside himself and stayed with her until she stopped crying. He did not mention it to anyone at the table. He simply went back to his seat when it was done. Eleanor looked at her sister. Clara met her eyes with the bright, unbothered confidence of someone presenting evidence, and very pleased with it. I am building a full picture, Clara said. Not just the sad parts, all of it. And I think the full picture is more interesting than people say. Eleanor did not say that she was grateful for this small addition to the picture, because she was, and because she suspected that admitting it would result in Clara spending the entire morning adding more pieces. She said instead that she ought to come down for breakfast, and Clara followed her, still talking. Edmund's carriage appeared on the north drive at 10:10. Eleanor was in the upstairs corridor when she heard the wheels on frost-hard gravel, and she happened to be near the corridor window, and she stood there and watched. She did not pretend she was doing anything else. The carriage came down the long approach, at a pace that was neither hurried nor leisurely, but simply steady. And when the door opened and Edmund Hartwell stepped out onto the pale gravel, Eleanor's first honest reaction was not what she had been bracing for. She had been bracing for someone who looked like loss, someone hollowed, or haunted, or visibly marked by everything that had happened to him. What she saw instead was a man who was completely, solidly present. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with the body of someone whose years in military service had left a permanent impression on how he carried himself. He wore a dark coat, and he moved without hurrying and without performing. And when he stopped on the gravel and looked at the front of the house, he looked at it with the calm, attentive steadiness of someone taking an accurate measure of something. Not impressed, not critical, simply paying attention. He shook her father's hand on the front step and went inside, and Eleanor stepped back from the window and stood for a moment with her hands folded in front of her. She breathed in, she breathed out, she went downstairs. Her mother had arranged the parlor with characteristic precision. The tea tray was perfect. Clara was seated and managing her expression with moderate success, meaning she looked openly excited rather than barely containing it. Lord Ashford made the introduction with the easy authority of someone who had handled awkward social situations for 30 years and found them, at this point, more interesting than troubling. And then Eleanor was standing in front of Edmund Hartwell, close enough to see his face properly for the first time, and what she saw there was not what she had expected either. His eyes were the color people had tried to describe and had not quite managed. A deep, serious gray, dense with something that was present beneath the surface, but not available on it. He looked at her directly, and she had the immediate and somewhat disconcerting impression that he was genuinely doing what she was doing, trying to form an accurate understanding of the person in front of him, as quickly and honestly as possible. He was not looking past her or through her. He was looking at her, in the way that meant he was actually there, actually paying attention, actually registering what he found. He bowed over her hand. Exactly correct, exactly controlled. "Miss Ashford," he said. His voice was lower than she had expected, and very even, as though each word had been placed rather than simply spoken. "Lord Edmund," she said, "I am glad the journey was comfortable." "Perfectly so," he said. "Thank you for the welcome. Nothing unnecessary." She noted it without resentment. It was what he had said it was, exactly what was needed, and nothing beyond it. Tea was managed ably by her father, and Eleanor observed Edmund through it, with the quiet focus she brought to things she genuinely wanted to understand. He answered questions directly and briefly. He did not fill silence. He did not perform. When Clara asked him about the horse she had heard about, he answered her with patient courtesy, and something in his expression shifted when Clara laughed at her own follow-up remark. Not a smile exactly, but a fraction of something opening for one moment, before it settled again. When her father made a dry remark about the autumn roads north of the city, Edmund responded with something so precisely dry and so unexpected that Eleanor looked at him across the table before she could manage not to. He did not look up, but at the corner of his mouth, briefly and barely, something moved that was not nothing. She looked back at her plate and allowed nothing to show on her face. Over lunch, she tested something. Not strategically. She simply said an honest thing and waited to see what came back. She mentioned a book, named it, said she had come close to abandoning it 3 times, but could not quite let it go. Edmund looked up from his plate and said that he had read the same book. She asked if he had enjoyed it. He said no. He said it had given him something to think about for several weeks, and he supposed that was what it had been for. She said that being made to think was sometimes more valuable than being made comfortable. He looked at her across the table, level and direct, and said, "That is an honest way to put it." She said she found honesty more efficient in the long run. He said, after one brief, considered pause. "We agree on something." He looked back at his plate. The conversation moved on. She did not make too much of this. But she noted the quality of the exchange. He had not softened his opinion to be agreeable. He had not added praise where none was honest. He had simply said, "We agree on something," as though the agreement were a small fact worth naming, and no more than that. She found this, obscurely, more reassuring than she would have found any compliment. After lunch, while Lord Ashford took Edmund to the study to review a preliminary version of the formal terms, Eleanor found herself in the library. She had gone there without quite deciding to, which was how she often ended up in libraries, not planning to be in one, and then simply being in one. She sat in the chair by the east window and looked at the frost-white garden below and let the morning's impressions settle without trying to arrange them into conclusions. She had learned long ago that conclusions formed better when they were not forced. George Whitmore arrived at 2 in the afternoon, and the house changed. He was large and warm and easy, and he loved Edmund with the straightforward, uncomplicated ease of a man who had known him for 30 years and found nothing difficult about it. He shook Eleanor's hand with both of his and told her it was a genuine pleasure and that Edmund had spoken well of her. She suspected this was not entirely true, but she appreciated the warmth behind it. He embraced Edmund with the physical ease of old friendship, and Edmund's posture shifted by one small, barely visible degree in George's company, something in the shoulder releasing, some held tension letting go the smallest amount. She was crossing the entrance hall when she heard Edmund laugh. She stopped walking. The laugh came from the morning room doorway, short and quiet, and entirely surprised out of him, escaped rather than offered, and she turned without deciding to. George had said something that had broken through in the specific way that old, safe friendships could break through, and Edmund was laughing. His whole face changed. Every careful, maintained layer of him came loose for 4 seconds, and what was underneath was warm and real and completely unguarded. A man who had not forgotten how. A man who had simply stopped allowing it for reasons that were very specific and very real. She saw him clearly. 4 seconds. Then he looked up and found her in the hallway. Everything came back. Instantly, completely, without drama. The composure, the stillness, the careful gray eyes. "Miss Ashford," he said, composed in a breath. She said something light to George, and excused herself, and went to the library, and sat in the chair by the east window, and did not read for a long time. She looked at the frost-white garden, and sat with what she had just seen. She had expected a man who was simply absent, hollow at the center, nothing left to reach. She had found a man who was locked. These were not the same thing. Locked things had keys. She did not know whether she had one, but the question had changed shape, and that mattered more than she was yet ready to admit. Later that afternoon, while Edmund was still in the study with her father, George Whitmore invited Eleanor to walk in the garden. She accepted. They went around the kitchen garden in the cold, late afternoon light, their breath making small clouds in the still air, and George talked without preamble, as someone who had decided to say something and saw no reason to wrap it in ceremony. He told her about the man Edmund had been before Catherine died. Not a different person, he said. Edmund had always been Edmund, serious, precise, minimal with words, relentless in his attention, but lighter. Lighter in the way of someone who has not yet had the lightness taken from him by something enormous and irrevocable. He had loved Catherine completely and without reservation, George said, and when she died, something in Edmund had turned entirely inward and had not come back out. He had managed everything correctly in the years since. He had fulfilled every obligation and performed every function his life required. But the part of him that had trusted the world to be something worth engaging with had gone very quiet, and had stayed quiet, and Edmund had stopped trying to reach it. "He is not broken," George said clearly, and said it in the way of someone who had wanted to say it to someone for a long time. "People say that about him. It is not quite right. He is defended, extraordinarily defended. But those are different things, and it matters that you know the difference." Eleanor walked beside him in the cold afternoon light. "How long have you been hoping to tell someone that?" she asked. George looked at her with his open, warm eyes. "Too long," he said. He paused. "Edmund told me you do not fill silence unnecessarily. He said it was one of the things he noticed about you first." She looked at the garden wall. "He said that?" "He did. He did not know he was telling me something important. He rarely does." George smiled. "He also said you read the same book he read last winter, and found it difficult, and read it anyway. He said you told him that difficult things were sometimes more valuable than comfortable ones." He paused. "He has thought about that." Eleanor walked in silence for a moment. "He mentioned that to you," she said. "He does not mention many things," George said, "which is why I pay attention when he does." They turned at the end of the path and walked back, and Eleanor carried what George had said carefully and did not speak of it again. Not broken. Defended. She turned those words over for the rest of the day, and let them do their work quietly, without direction. Dinner that evening was the warmest the house had been since Edmund arrived. George carried the conversation with generous skill, and everyone was easier under his influence. And Edmund made 2 observations during the meal that were both precise and quietly, unexpectedly funny. Both times Eleanor met his eyes when he said them and let him see, without exaggerating it, that she had found them worth hearing. Both times he held her gaze for one level, unhurried moment before looking away. She did not try to hold the moments longer than they were. After dinner, when the household was dispersing toward the evening, and Clara had pulled George into an argument about a book she had been reading, Edmund appeared beside Eleanor at the entrance to the corridor and said, quietly, "I have taken more than enough of your family's hospitality this week. I want you to know that I am aware of that, and grateful." She looked at him. He was saying it plainly, without performance, because he meant it. "You are welcome here," she said, equally plainly. "That is not a social form. You are genuinely welcome." He looked at her for a moment, then he said, "You have an unusual way of meaning what you say." "Most people do, when they are paying attention," she said. Something shifted in his expression, small and quick, and then he nodded once, and they went their separate ways for the night. She lay in bed afterward and thought about what he had said. "You have an unusual way of meaning what you say." He had said it as an observation, not a compliment, not a criticism, simply a thing he had noticed and found worth naming. She could not decide whether she found this reassuring or destabilizing, and eventually decided it was probably both, and went to sleep. The next morning she was in the kitchen garden before breakfast, because she could not stay in bed, and walking helped when her mind was running. She was on the outer circuit of the frost-crunched path, when she heard footsteps, and turned to find Edmund coming around the hedge with his coat on, over his shirt, and his breath misting white in the cold air. He stopped when he saw her. They were equally surprised. "I walk in the mornings," he said. An explanation, not an apology. "I usually do not," she said. "I could not sleep." "I walk because I rarely can," he said, simply and without drama. She fell into step beside him, and he did not break stride. They walked the outer path without speaking, the morning pale and clean, and very still around them. She noted that he did not make conversation to fill the silence, and that she did not either, and that the silence between them was not uncomfortable. After a while, Edmund said that she had not asked him any of the questions most people asked when they first met him. She asked what questions he meant. He said, questions about Calverton Hall, about its size and its history, about London, about people they knew in common, about his years in the regiment. Questions, he said, that people asked when they were nervous and needed something safe to fill the space with. "I fill space poorly," she said. "I have always found it more useful to leave it and see what comes into it naturally." He was quiet for one considered moment. Then he said, "I have found these past 2 days less difficult than I expected." She did not reach for that. She did not add to it or make it larger than it was. She said, "I am glad of that," simply. And they walked to the end of the path and went in for breakfast. She carried what he had said all day, folded carefully, telling no one. Less difficult than expected. She thought about what that meant from a man who had been bracing himself for difficulty. She thought about George's words, not broken, defended. She thought about 4 seconds of unguarded laughter, and a slim green book, chosen 2 mornings in a row, and the steadiness of gray eyes that held hers without flinching. That evening her mother came to the small sitting room where Eleanor was reading, and sat beside her without preamble, and said that Edmund had spoken to her father at length about the formal terms, and that everything was agreed. She said it with her usual neutral efficiency. Then she paused, which was unusual for her mother, and said, "He asked your father one question that was not in the formal terms." Eleanor looked at her. Lady Ashford said, "He asked whether you were well, not in the context of health or social standing. He asked whether you were genuinely well, and when your father said you were, Edmund said good, and returned to the documents." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That is something." "Yes," her mother said. "I thought so too." She went to bed that night with the particular complicated feeling of someone who has walked into a room, expecting it to be empty, and found it occupied by something she does not yet have a name for. She was not hopeful, exactly. She was not willing to call it hope. But she was something she had not been 3 nights ago. She was curious. She was genuinely, honestly, eyes open curious about what came next, and that felt like something she could work with. She heard it standing on the bottom step of the staircase, and the thing that stayed with her longest afterward was not the words themselves, but the silence that came after them. The way her mother said nothing for a long moment before she replied, as though she already knew, as though this was a thing that had been agreed upon already, and was simply being stated clearly for the record. Eleanor had come downstairs early, earlier than usual, earlier than the household expected. She had woken at 5:30 with a headache, and dressed quietly, and come down before Nell was awake. She needed tea, and she needed movement, and she needed to be somewhere other than the ceiling of her bedroom, which she had been staring at since 3 in the morning. The study door was open by 2 inches. The lamp inside was already lit. Edmund's voice, low and very even, came through the gap, and she heard her own name in the first sentence, and stopped walking. "I want to be honest with you, Lady Ashford," he said. "I believe you deserve it, and I believe misunderstanding on this particular point would serve neither of us." A pause. "I respect Eleanor very much. I will honor every obligation this marriage requires, completely and without exception. She will want for nothing that is within my power to provide. But I must say something plainly, and I would ask you to receive it as honesty rather than unkindness." Another pause, shorter this time. "I am not capable of love. Not in the way that a young woman entering a marriage has the right to expect. I was capable of it, once. I am no longer. It closed in me when Catherine died, and it has not reopened, and I do not believe it will. I am not saying this to cause pain, and I am not saying it as a criticism of your daughter in any way. I am saying it because I believe it would be a far greater cruelty to allow her to expect something I cannot give than to say this now, while there is still time to understand each other clearly." Then her mother's voice, quiet and careful. "I understand, Edmund. I am grateful." It is not a comfortable thing to say. Her mother, no, but it was right to say it. "Edmund, I can offer a great deal, Lady Ashford, in practical terms, and in terms of genuine regard and respect, but I would not want Eleanor to spend the first years of this marriage waiting for something that is not coming. I would rather she know from the beginning what the terms are, so she can decide how to live within them honestly." Her mother said something else, very quietly, that Eleanor could not make out. Then Edmund said something equally quiet in return. And then there was a long pause, that meant they had moved to something else, something administrative and practical, and Eleanor was no longer listening, because she was no longer capable of listening. She stood on the bottom step of the staircase, with her hand on the banister, and her feet completely still. She did not move for a long time. She stood there and let the words move through her, and settle wherever they were going to settle. And she tried to be honest with herself about what she was feeling, because dishonesty at one's own expense was the least useful kind. She was not surprised. That was the first thing she had to say to herself, and she said it clearly. She had been bracing for it. Some part of her had been holding herself ready for exactly this knowledge, and it had arrived now, directly and without softening, in Edmund's own voice, and while it was harder to hear it said aloud than to suspect it in the abstract, she could not honestly say she had not expected it. She had expected it. She had been expecting it since the first time someone said his name in a certain tone of voice, in a certain kind of room. She turned around. She walked back up the stairs at her normal pace, without hurrying. She went to her bedroom and closed the door quietly behind her, and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the opposite wall. She did not cry. She had cried very little in her life, not from coldness but from the practical understanding that crying did not change things, and that things needed to change. She sat on the edge of the bed in the early morning light, and held what she had heard, and looked at it from every angle she could find. Edmund would never love her. He had said so. He had said it to her mother with the particular honesty of a man who found dishonesty more cruel than truth, and she could not argue with the intention behind it, even as she sat with the weight of the thing itself. She was going to stop trying. This was the decision that came to her, sitting on the bed in the cold morning light, and it came not with drama, but with the quiet precision of something that had been waiting to be decided. She had been trying for 2.5 days. She had been watching for signs, adjusting herself to signals she was not supposed to have noticed, tilting toward the warmth she had glimpsed in Edmund's expression, and hoping it meant something it did not mean. She had been doing it without acknowledging it, which was the most dangerous kind of trying, because it was the kind you could not stop if you did not see it clearly. She saw it now, and she was stopping. Not because the situation was hopeless, and not out of pride, and not out of self-protection, though all three of those things were present in the decision in some measure. She was stopping because Edmund had been honest with her, in the only way available to him. And honesty deserved to be met with honesty. His honesty was this: he could not love her. Her honesty, answering it, was this: she was not going to pretend that she could pull love out of someone who had told her clearly it was not there to find. She was not going to spend 50 years leaning toward a man who was facing in a different direction and call it a life. She would be his wife. She had already decided this, and she did not change it. She would be a good wife, and a capable one, and an honest one. She would run his household and manage his obligations, and treat him with every courtesy and genuine kindness she was capable of, because she was genuinely capable of a great deal of it. She would be content, and she would find her contentment from within herself, and from the life she built inside the practical terms of the marriage, and she would not make Edmund Hartwell responsible for providing it. He had been clear about what he could offer. She would take what he offered and make of it what she could, and she would not ask him for the rest. She stood up, straightened her dress, and went to the window. The morning outside was cold and still, and beginning to lighten. She looked at the frost on the kitchen garden walls, and the pale gravel of the drive, and the long empty road beyond, and she felt, beneath the weight of what she had heard, something that surprised her, something that felt, very slightly, like a kind of freedom. She did not have to try anymore. She did not have to watch and wait and angle herself toward warmth that was not coming. She could simply be herself, fully and without agenda, inside whatever space this marriage made, and she was, when it came to being fully herself, genuinely very good at it. She had spent years practicing being other things for other people's comfort. She was tired of it. Here, inside the honest terms Edmund had described, she would not have to do that. She went downstairs and made her tea, and carried it back up and drank it at her writing desk. And by the time Nell came at 7, she was composed, and ready, and clear-eyed, in a way she had not entirely been for 3 weeks. The announcement dinner that evening was the largest event the Ashford house had hosted in 2 years. 37 guests, her mother had said. All the local families who would need to know before the public notice appeared. Eleanor dressed in the deep blue silk her mother had chosen, and it was a good dress and she wore it well. She came downstairs and stood in the receiving line beside Edmund, and shook hands and said the right things, and accepted every congratulation with a warmth that was not performed. She was good at warmth. It came naturally to her, even when the situation beneath it was complicated. Edmund was beside her through the receiving line, and through the early part of the dinner, with the correctness and composure she now understood were simply his ordinary register. He was not cold toward her. He was never cold toward her. He was courteous and attentive to everything she said, and he gave no outward indication that the morning conversation in the study had happened. She gave none either. They stood side by side, and were introduced to people, and thanked them, and it was all perfectly fine, because she had decided that morning what the terms were, and now she was simply living inside them, and they turned out to be terms she could manage. At one point in the evening, they were briefly separated by the natural movement of guests, and Eleanor found herself across the room from Edmund, and happened to look up, and found him already looking at her. She did not know what he was thinking. She was no longer trying to figure out what he was thinking. She met his gaze for one steady, level moment, and then looked at the person who had just spoken to her, because she had decided that morning to stop searching his face for things he had told her clearly were not there. She was done with that, and it felt better to be done with it than she had expected. Later in the evening, during the shifting between dinner courses when the room was loud with conversation, Edmund appeared beside her and said quietly, "You have managed this very well. I know it is not an easy evening. You have been graceful throughout it. I wanted to say that." She held his gaze for a moment. "Thank you," she said. "You have been equally graceful." A brief pause, he said, "I hope the terms of this are not too difficult for you." She understood that he meant more than the dinner. She said, "I am a practical person. I prefer honest terms to comfortable ones." She looked back at the room. "We will do well, I think." He said nothing more, but he nodded, the small, decided nod of someone who has registered something important, and moved away, and Eleanor stood in the middle of the room, surrounded by guests, celebrating her engagement, and felt, for the first time since the whole arrangement had begun, genuinely steady on her feet. Clara found her after the dessert course, when the guests were beginning to move toward the drawing room and things were slightly less formal. She pulled Eleanor into the corridor and looked at her with the particular expression she wore when she was going to ask a real question, and knew it. "Are you all right?" Clara said. "I am," Eleanor said, and meant it. "He is very quiet," Clara said carefully. "I do not mean unkindly. I mean that he is the kind of quiet that has a great deal inside it. I noticed that all evening." "Yes," Eleanor said. "He is." Clara looked at her for a moment. "Are you going to be all right?" she said, which was a different question. Eleanor looked at her sister, the 17-year-old who had spent 3 weeks building a full picture out of second-hand accounts, and who had asked a question tonight that was more accurate than most of what people twice her age had managed. She said, "I am going to build something real at Calverton Hall, Clara. I have decided. It may not look like what anyone expects a marriage to look like, but it will be genuine, and I am better at genuine things than at any other kind." Clara looked at her for a long moment. Then she hugged her, hard and briefly, the way she had always hugged Eleanor when she meant it. Eleanor hugged her back. After the guests had gone and the house had settled into night, Eleanor sat at her writing desk and wrote to Clara. She wrote a long letter, the kind she sealed without rereading. She wrote that she was glad of Clara's question in the corridor, that it had been the kindest thing anyone had said to her all evening. She wrote that she intended to be very happy at Calverton Hall. She wrote, "Not in the way anyone else will understand, perhaps, but in the way that is actually mine." She sealed the letter. She sat for a moment in the lamplight with her hands folded and thought about 11 weeks. 11 weeks until the wedding. 11 weeks until Calverton Hall. She was not afraid. She had stopped being afraid on the bottom step of the staircase at 5:30 that morning. What had replaced the fear was something harder and quieter and considerably more useful. She was a sensible woman, and a stubborn one, and she was going to need to be both. She blew out the lamp and went to bed, and in the morning the world began to look different, because she was seeing it through the eyes of a woman who had stopped waiting to find out what kind of marriage she was walking into, and had decided, quietly and without fanfare, to determine that herself. The morning of the wedding arrived cold and absolutely clear, the kind of November day that looked beautiful from inside, and felt like a statement when you stepped out into it. Eleanor stood at the window of her bedroom in the Ashford house for the last time, fully dressed, in the cream silk gown her mother had overseen with characteristic precision, and looked at the frost-bright morning outside. She had slept well. This still surprised her each morning, the sleeping well, when she considered how restless she had been in the weeks leading up to Edmund's first visit. She slept well now, because she had stopped trying to figure out what the marriage was going to be, and had simply decided. Nell came to adjust the veil with the focused efficiency of someone who had been looking forward to this task for weeks. Clara came to the doorway and looked at Eleanor with an expression that was trying very hard not to be tearful, and was not entirely succeeding. "You look exactly right," Clara said. "I feel exactly right," Eleanor said, and meant it in a way she had not expected to mean it. Her father knocked at 9:30 and came in and said nothing for a moment, just looked at her with the expression of a man who had a great deal to say and had decided that the moment required him not to say any of it. She kissed his cheek and told him she was ready, and they went down. The church was cold inside in the way of stone churches in November, and it was full of people in their best clothing. Eleanor walked down the aisle on her father's arm and looked first at the light coming through the east window, the way it fell in a long, clean angle across the stone floor. Then she looked at Edmund. He was standing at the front of the church in a dark coat, with his hands folded at his sides, and his posture entirely correct, and when she looked at him he was already looking at her. He had been watching her come down the aisle. He looked at her the way he always looked at her, directly, without performance, with genuine attention. As she came toward him, she thought about the decision she had made the morning she overheard him in the study. She thought about how it had not made her smaller. It had made her, in some quiet way she was still understanding, more herself. She was not walking toward Edmund Hartwell in the hope of changing him, or winning anything from him that he had said plainly was not available. She was walking toward him as a woman who had assessed the situation honestly and decided what to do inside it. He held out his hand when she reached him. She took it. His grip was firm and steady, and when they turned to face the minister together, She heard him exhale once, very quietly, and she thought that perhaps he too had spent 11 weeks settling himself into what this was going to be. The vows were the traditional ones. They said them to each other with equal steadiness, neither of them rushing, neither of them performing. Edmund's voice was even and clear. Eleanor's was the same. When the minister pronounced them married, Edmund turned to her, and there was one moment, a brief and particular moment, in which he looked at her with something in his expression that she could not quite name. Not warmth exactly, not tenderness, something more like the specific gravity of two people who have agreed to something serious and understand the weight of it. The reception at the Ashford house was managed beautifully by her mother, who had been planning it for 11 weeks, and whose planning was evident in every detail. George Whitmore was there, and his presence made everything easier, as it always did. He clapped Edmund on the shoulder and kissed Eleanor's hand, and told her 3 separate things that made her laugh, which was generous of him. Clara was everywhere at once, bright and animated. Edmund moved through the reception with the correctness and composure that she now understood as simply the structure of him. He stayed near Eleanor more than protocol required. She noticed this without making anything of it. When George made a remark at the table that was designed to be funny, and was, Edmund smiled, a full and real smile, and Eleanor, who was sitting across from him, saw it happen, and thought, there it is. The thing I saw for 4 seconds in the hallway. There it is again. She looked back at her plate, and said nothing, and asked nothing of the moment. She simply noted it, and held it. In the carriage to Calverton Hall that afternoon, they were alone together for the first time without her family around them. The carriage was well appointed, and the roads were good, and the late afternoon light was coming gold through the carriage windows. Eleanor looked at the passing fields, and after a while she said, "You do not have to make conversation." He looked at her. She said, "I mean that genuinely. You can simply be, if you prefer." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "What were you thinking about, looking at the window?" She considered the question honestly. She said, "That it is an interesting thing, to be traveling toward a place I have never seen, that is going to be home for the rest of my life. There is something both frightening and freeing about it." He said, "Which is it more?" She said, "Freeing. Today it is freeing." He nodded and looked back at the window, and they traveled in a silence that was honest rather than uncomfortable. Calverton Hall appeared around a long curve in the road, in the blue late afternoon light, and Eleanor, who had prepared herself for it to be large, found that preparation had not quite been sufficient. It was large in the way that places are large when they have been there for a very long time, and have earned the space they occupy. It was old and stone-built, and settled into its landscape, with the permanence of something that did not consider going anywhere. It was also, in the particular light of that November afternoon. "It is extraordinary," she said. "It requires a great deal of work," Edmund said, and she heard something in his voice that was not quite pride and not quite weariness, but somewhere between the two, the voice of someone who knows something in the way of genuine personal knowledge. Mrs. Holt met them at the door. She was a compact, quick-moving woman in her late 50s, with gray hair and very sharp eyes, and the bearing of someone who had been managing Calverton Hall since before Edmund inherited it. She greeted Eleanor with correct courtesy and took her measure in the space of approximately 8 seconds, and Eleanor met her assessment directly and without any of the performance she had found, sometimes caused more problems than it solved, simply looking at Mrs. Holt with her ordinary honest attention and waiting to see what came back. Something in the housekeeper's expression shifted very slightly in response. Not approval exactly, recognition perhaps. Eleanor noted it. The staff had assembled in the hall to be introduced. Eleanor moved through the line and looked at each person properly when she shook their hand, and she asked each one a single direct question and listened to the answer, and by the end, she had learned 12 names and attached them correctly to 12 faces and 12 brief facts about those faces, because she was genuinely interested in the people she was going to live among. The first dinner as husband and wife was served in the small dining room, which was, Eleanor discovered, not particularly small. They sat at either end of the long table, and the space between them had the quality of a distance that was physical, but also otherwise. A distance of two people who were still, in all the ways that mattered, in the very early days of knowing each other. Edmund asked her what she had thought of the house on first impression. She said she had found it more beautiful than she expected, and less cold than she had been told. He said that was what most people said, in exactly that order. She asked whether most people found it less cold as they grew more familiar with it. He said, some do. He did not say which category he fell into, and she did not ask. After dinner, he showed her the library himself, rather than sending a servant, which she had not expected, and thought was a genuine act of consideration. The library was large and very well stocked, and smelled of old paper and wood smoke in a way that Eleanor found immediately and genuinely comforting. She moved along the shelves for several minutes, and he stood in the center of the room and watched her without saying anything, and she pulled out 2 volumes and said she hoped he did not mind if she borrowed them. He said the library was hers to use as she wished. She said thank you, and meant it simply, without reading anything into the offer. He said goodnight to her in the corridor outside her rooms, with the same correct courtesy he brought to everything, and went to his own rooms. And Eleanor went inside, and stood in the middle of her new bedroom, and looked at the size of it. The bed was large, and the ceilings were high, and everything was very old, and very well made, and very quiet. She was the Duchess of Calverton. She was in Calverton Hall. She was married to Edmund Hartwell, who was correct and honest and kind in a minimal way, and who would never love her. These were the terms. She had agreed to them with open eyes. She sat at the writing desk by the window and wrote to Clara. She wrote that Calverton Hall was extraordinary, and that Mrs. Holt seemed very capable, and that the library alone was reason enough to have come. She wrote that Edmund had shown her the library himself, and that he had been courteous throughout the day in every way. She wrote, I am going to be happy here. I have decided. I know that might seem like a strange thing to say, but I have learned this week that decisions matter more than circumstances, and I have made mine. She sealed the letter, and went to the window, and looked out at the dark Calverton grounds. The estate stretched away in every direction, enormous and quiet under the November sky. This was going to be her home. She was going to make it one, properly and genuinely, and on terms that did not depend on Edmund's heart being available for the making. She was a woman who was good at building things. She had always been good at it. She was going to begin tomorrow, and the day after that, and the day after that, until she had built something she was proud of, inside the honest space she had been given. She went to bed, and, somewhat to her own surprise, slept at once, and deeply. 3 months into the marriage, Eleanor Hartwell was in the middle of a firm conversation with a stubborn landowner about the access road to the village school, when Mrs. Holt appeared in the doorway of the estate office with an expression that meant there was something to deal with. Eleanor held up one finger at Mrs. Holt, finished the conversation with the landowner in 4 more sentences, brought it to a clean resolution, and then turned to the housekeeper and asked what was needed. This was, by the beginning of February, approximately what Tuesdays looked like at Calverton Hall. Eleanor had mapped the estate with the systematic attention she brought to everything she was serious about. She had walked every room of the hall itself, every outbuilding, every garden and path and field boundary, in the first 6 weeks. She had spoken to every member of the staff individually, not in the managed way of a lady of the house performing accessibility, but genuinely, because she found that people told you a great deal when they understood you were actually listening. She had identified 3 charitable programs attached to the estate that had been managed, for the past several years, with the benign neglect of an institution whose master had other things on his mind. She had begun reorganizing them methodically, starting with the village school, which had a leaking roof, and a land access dispute that had been going unresolved for 14 months. She had also, somewhere in the middle of all of this, stopped trying to reach Edmund. It had happened gradually, and without announcement. She had made the decision, standing on the staircase in her family home, and she had held it, and by the time she arrived at Calverton Hall, she had been holding it long enough that it had become something natural, rather than something effortful. She was not cold to Edmund. She was never cold to him. She was warm and honest and present in every conversation they had, and she gave him her genuine opinion when he asked for it, and her genuine attention when he deserved it, which was often, because Edmund Hartwell was, she was discovering, a person worth paying attention to. But she did not lean toward him. She did not watch him for signs or look for openings, or make small gestures designed to soften something in him. She had decided that the man she had glimpsed briefly was not currently available, and she was not going to spend 50 years reaching for an unavailable thing. It was remarkable, she had discovered, how much energy she had freed up by stopping. She had that energy now, and she put it into everything. She put it into the estate programs and into the library and into the mornings she spent walking the grounds alone in the thin February light, and into the letters she wrote to Clara, and into the friendship she was slowly, carefully building with Mrs. Holt, who had decided somewhere around the 6th week that Eleanor was going to be useful and had begun treating her accordingly, which was the closest Mrs. Holt came to warmth, and which Eleanor found more satisfying than effusive welcome would have been. She was happy. This surprised her each time she recognized it, because she had not expected to be genuinely happy. She had expected to manage. She had expected to find a way to make do with the practical terms of the marriage, and find satisfaction in the work and the estate and the responsibilities she was accumulating, and she had planned to call that happiness without quite believing it. But it turned out to be actual happiness, the quiet and genuine kind that had nothing performative in it, the kind that came from doing real work among real people and being entirely herself inside it. Edmund kept his routine with the regularity of someone for whom routine was a form of order that made everything else bearable. He was in his study before sunrise every morning, and rode out alone most afternoons, and was at dinner every evening without exception. Dinner was always courteous and sometimes genuinely interesting. Edmund had a mind that was precise and wide-ranging, and, Eleanor was discovering, quite well read, in ways that were not always obvious from his general brevity. When something engaged his attention properly, he could be unexpectedly thoughtful to talk with. Eleanor contributed honestly to these conversations, giving her real opinions rather than careful ones, and he received them the same way. They were not close, but they were not performing at each other either, and after a lifetime of watching people perform at each other, Eleanor had a genuine and considerable appreciation for this. She no longer came to the study after dinner, as she had done in the first weeks. She had stopped when she realized she was doing it to be noticed, rather than because she had a reason, and stopping it had been easy once she saw it clearly. She spent her evenings in the library or the small sitting room, and she was perfectly content there. One afternoon in early February, Eleanor went to the village school to check on the progress of the roof repairs she had arranged. It was a small stone building on the edge of the village green, with 12 children in it between the ages of 5 and 12, managed by a young woman named Ada who had been teaching there for 3 years, and who was, Eleanor had immediately understood, very good at it. The children were working through arithmetic at the long table, and Ada was moving among them with patient, focused attention. And Eleanor stood in the doorway for a moment, and watched, and felt something settle in her that had been slightly unsettled since the morning of the announcement dinner. This was real. This was hers. This was something she had fixed with her own effort, and her own time, and her own insistence. And 43 children were going to come to this building through a winter that did not leak on them, because of what she had done. It was not a small thing in the context of a life. Ada saw her, and came to the door, and they talked about the children, and about a concern Ada had regarding one of the older students, who she felt was ready for more difficult work than the school could currently provide. Eleanor listened, and then said she wanted to look into options, and would come back with something to discuss. Ada looked at her with the expression of someone who was not quite used to being taken seriously when they brought things up, which told Eleanor something specific about how this conversation had gone in the past, and which made her very certain she was going to find a solution. She walked back to Calverton Hall in the cold afternoon light, with the particular energy of someone who has done something real, and she came in through the side entrance and nearly walked directly into Edmund in the corridor, who was coming back from the stables. He looked at her. She was mud-hemmed and slightly out of breath, and clearly pleased about something. "The school," she said, by way of explanation. "Mrs. Holt mentioned you had gone," he said. He looked at her for a moment. "How did you find it?" "Excellent," she said. "Ada is remarkable. There is a student who needs more than the school can currently provide, and I would like to look into options." She paused. "If you have thoughts about how things of this kind have been managed historically on the estate, I would be glad to hear them." He looked at her with something that was not quite surprise but was adjacent to it. "I will think about it," he said, "and tell you what I know." She said thank you, and went to change, and he went to his study, and they met again at dinner, and he told her what he knew, which was more than she had expected, and the dinner was the longest and most interesting one they had had in 3 months. One evening in early March, she was coming out of the library with a book when she nearly walked directly into Edmund in the corridor. He was coming from the direction of the small sitting room. She had been in the small sitting room herself an hour earlier, and had left when she finished her tea. He said he was sorry, which surprised her, it being the first time she had heard him say the word. They stood in the corridor for a moment that was not quite awkward. He said, "You were not in the sitting room this evening." She said, "I was in the library." He said, "I see." He stepped aside to let her pass. She went to her rooms. She lay in bed that night and thought about the shape of the life she was building. She thought, "I am satisfied." Not happy in any elevated or complicated way. Satisfied, the way you were satisfied with work that was genuine and ongoing and made a real difference to something real. She thought, "This is enough." She turned out the lamp and went to sleep. She did not think about Edmund Hartwell or gray eyes or locked rooms, because she had decided those thoughts were not useful, and she was a practical woman, and she only kept thoughts that were useful. But in his study on the other side of the house, Edmund Hartwell sat for a long time in his chair by the fire, with an unread book in his lap, and the fire burned low around him, and the house was very quiet, and he thought about the corridor and the library, and the sitting room she had not been in, and he could not quite have said what he was thinking, except that something had changed in the house, and he could not determine whether he had changed it or she had, and he was not, for the first time in a long time, entirely certain that the distinction mattered. Edmund came around the corner of the blue sitting room door on a Thursday afternoon in late March and stopped walking. Lord Oliver Crane was in the armchair nearest the window, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees and an expression of genuine interest on his face, and Eleanor was on the small sofa across from him, laughing. She was laughing in the unguarded, unconsidered way of someone who has heard something that surprised it out of her, and the sound of it was something Edmund had not heard before. He had heard her smile, if smiling had a sound, which in Eleanor's case it did. But this was different. This was Eleanor completely off guard, completely herself, and it stopped him in the doorway more thoroughly than if he had walked into a wall. Oliver looked up and saw him first. "Edmund," he said, rising, "your wife was just telling me that she spent the first morning she arrived here attempting to reorganize the estate library, and discovered that your system of cataloging has not been updated since approximately your grandfather's time." Edmund looked at Eleanor. She met his eyes with the calm, direct steadiness that was simply how she looked at things. The laughter was gone from her face, but the warmth of it was still there, around the edges of her expression. "It has not been my highest priority," Edmund said. "I am working on it," Eleanor said. "It is a substantial undertaking." Oliver Crane was 41, 4 years older than Edmund, and he had the easy, unguarded warmth of a man who had decided somewhere in early middle age that life was too short for pretense. He had been a good friend to Edmund in the years after Catherine died, in the specific way of someone who did not push and did not perform, and simply showed up when the season brought him nearby, and behaved as though nothing was different. Oliver stayed for 3 days. During those 3 days, Edmund noticed several things he did not entirely know what to do with. He noticed that Eleanor was different in Oliver's company than she was in his, not more herself exactly. She was always herself, which was one of the particular and slightly destabilizing things about her, but easier. More at ease in the way of someone who did not feel any particular need to be careful. Oliver paid genuine attention to her, not the flattering, performative attention of a man trying to charm, but the real attention of someone who found her interesting and was not hiding the fact. He asked her questions about the estate programs, and listened to the answers, and asked follow-up questions that showed he had understood what she said. He asked her opinions on things that had nothing to do with the house. He laughed at what she said when it was funny, which was often enough that Edmund, watching from across rooms in which he was apparently also present, felt increasingly like a piece of furniture. He noticed that he did not like this. He did not examine the feeling carefully enough to name it, but it was there, a low and persistent discomfort behind his sternum that would not resolve itself into anything he could easily set aside. On the second afternoon of Oliver's visit, he invited Eleanor to ride, and she said yes. Edmund said, without having planned to, "I will join you." Oliver looked at him with something between surprise and amusement that he kept off his face with the skill of long practice. The three of them rode out across the east fields in the cold March afternoon, and Edmund found himself, without intending to and without quite knowing when it had started, riding close to Eleanor, rather than at his usual comfortable distance from everyone. He was aware of her in a way that was different from his usual awareness. This was particular. He was aware of the way she sat on her horse, comfortably and without any particular elegance, which was somehow more appealing than elegance would have been. She answered Oliver's questions without ever glancing at Edmund to gauge his reaction, which meant she was simply saying what she actually thought. She said several things during that ride that were precise and a little unexpected, and one thing that was funny enough that Edmund laughed before he could prevent it. Oliver looked at him when he laughed. Edmund looked at the horizon. Back at the house, while Eleanor was inside with Mrs. Holt over something to do with dinner, Oliver found Edmund in the stable yard and said, without preamble, "She is extraordinary." "Yes," Edmund said. "You know that," Oliver said. It was not a question. Edmund looked at him. "Yes," he said again. Oliver was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "She is not trying to reach you, Edmund. I do not know if you have noticed. Most people who marry someone like you spend the first year trying very hard to reach the person behind the walls. Eleanor is not doing that. She has simply gone and built something of her own." Edmund said nothing. "I think," Oliver said carefully, "that this might be the most generous thing anyone has ever done for you, whether it was intentional or not." He went inside. Edmund stood in the stable yard alone for a while and thought about this, and did not arrive at any conclusion except that Oliver was right and that he did not know what to do with Oliver being right. That evening, Eleanor was already in the drawing room when Edmund came down, sitting near the fire with a book open in her lap and a cup of tea at her elbow, entirely absorbed. She looked up when he came in, greeted him with the warmth that was simply her ordinary register, and went back to her reading. He sat across the room with his own book and did not read it. He watched her read, which she was entirely unaware of, and he thought about what Oliver had said. She has simply gone and built something of her own. It was true. He could see it clearly, now that someone had named it. She had come into his house and made it into something else, not by changing what it was, but by filling it with her own genuine presence. She had befriended Mrs. Holt, which he had believed was impossible. She had reorganized the charitable programs. She had gone to the village school and come back muddy and pleased with herself. She had done all of it without looking at him to see if he had noticed, without angling any of it in his direction, without any of the elaborate, subtle performance of someone trying to demonstrate their worth. She had simply done what she was interested in doing, and the house had become more alive around her, and she had never once indicated that she expected him to give her credit for it. That night he was restless in a way he had not been in a long time. Not the familiar restlessness of grief, which he knew well and had learned to accommodate. This was something different, something without a clear origin, that would not resolve itself into anything he could name. He lay awake in his room and listened to the old house settle around him, and thought about Eleanor in the East Fields that afternoon, saying what she actually thought without checking to see if it landed correctly, being fully and entirely herself in a way that owed nothing to anyone around her. He thought about Oliver saying, "She is not trying to reach you." He lay there for a long time. He did not sleep until well past midnight, and when he did sleep, it was restlessly, and in the morning he came down to breakfast before Eleanor had appeared and sat at the table alone with his coffee, and found himself, for the first time in a long time, waiting for someone. He sat with this uncomfortable discovery for approximately 5 minutes. Then Eleanor came in, still in her morning walking coat with frost on the hem, carrying a letter she was already reading. She said good morning, without looking up. He said good morning back. She sat down and poured her tea without interrupting her reading, and he watched her for a moment and felt the discomfort in his sternum shift slightly, like something finding a more permanent place to settle. He picked up the newspaper. He read the same paragraph 4 times. He said nothing to her about any of it. He was not ready to. He was not even sure what he would say if he were ready. He only knew that something was different, and that the difference had his attention, and that it had been there for longer than he had admitted to himself. The letter arrived on a Wednesday morning in late March, and Eleanor read it, at the estate office desk, with the calm, focused expression she brought to problems that required immediate attention, rather than immediate reaction. The solicitor representing the Branton family was informing her, in precise and slightly threatening legal language, that the charitable school's use of the old granary building on the eastern edge of the Calverton estate boundary was being contested on the basis of an easement agreement that the Branton family claimed predated the current arrangement. The school had been operating in that building for 9 years. There were 43 children who attended it. If the contest was upheld, The school would be without premises at the end of the summer term. Eleanor set the letter on the desk and looked at it for a moment. Then she picked up her pen and began making notes. She spent the morning writing 3 letters, one to the solicitor representing the Branton estate, one to the county records office to request copies of the historical easement documents, and one to the vicar, who had been involved in the school's establishment 9 years ago and might have relevant correspondence from that time. She was calm throughout. Problems of this kind were not, in her experience, solved by reacting to them. They were solved by identifying the actual nature of the dispute and finding the specific point at which the 2 sides could be brought to agreement. She did not think about telling Edmund. Mrs. Holt apparently mentioned the solicitor's letter to Edmund at some point that afternoon, because Edmund appeared in the doorway of the estate office at 4:30, with an expression that was more alert than his usual steady composure. "The Branton easement," he said. Eleanor looked up from the document she was comparing with the county records notes. "I am managing it," she said. "I know you are," he said. He came into the room and stood across the desk from her. "I also know that a letter from my solicitor to their solicitor would resolve it considerably more quickly than the route you are taking." "Possibly," she said, "but the route I am taking will resolve it in a way that addresses the actual disagreement rather than simply overpowering them. If I overwhelm them with the estate's authority, they will find another point of contest within the year." Edmund looked at her for a moment. "You have thought about this carefully," he said. "Since this morning," she said. He was quiet. Then he said, "If you need the estate's name, it is available, at whatever point you judge it useful, rather than counterproductive." She looked at him. He was not trying to manage her, or correct her, or take the problem from her. He was offering a resource and leaving the decision entirely with her. She found this, coming from Edmund, genuinely striking. "Thank you," she said. "I will tell you if that changes." He nodded and left. The school problem took 10 days to resolve. She resolved it through the route she had described, finding the historical records, identifying the specific language in the original easement agreement that the Branton solicitor had misread, and bringing both parties to a conversation in which the misreading was demonstrated clearly and a formal correction was agreed. The school kept its premises. When Edmund came to find her in the library afterward and she told him it was done, he stood in the doorway and looked at her and said, "You did not need my help." She said, "No," but the offer was genuinely kind. He looked at her for a moment that was slightly longer than his usual measured moments. Then he said, "I have been watching what you have done here. With the programs, the staff, all of it. Calverton Hall is better than it was. I wanted to say that," she said. "Thank you, Edmund. That matters to me." He nodded and moved on, and Eleanor went back to her book. The weeks that followed brought something she could feel but could not quite articulate. Edmund began appearing in rooms where she was with a frequency that was slightly more than coincidental. Not intrusively, never intrusively. He would come to the library and choose a book and sit in the opposite chair and read. He would appear at the estate office with a question that could have been sent through Mrs. Holt and was not. He began staying longer after dinner, remaining at the table past the point where he had previously excused himself, and once or twice the conversation that followed was the longest and most genuinely interesting they had had in over a year. One evening he asked her opinion on a decision he was facing about the management of the northern fields. It was a genuine question, genuinely asked, and she gave him a genuine answer, which included one recommendation he had not considered, and one concern about his proposed approach, that he spent a moment quietly thinking through, before he acknowledged that she was right. He came back 2 days later with a follow-up question about the same matter. She answered it. He listened with the full attention he brought to everything he considered worth attending to. One evening she went to bed feeling something that she examined carefully before she named. She was sitting at the writing desk before she blew out the lamp, and she looked at the dark window and thought about the conversation she and Edmund had had after dinner, the longest one yet, about the village and the school, and the historical relationship between the estate and the families who had worked it for generations. She thought about how Edmund knew this history in a way that was not performative pride, but quiet, specific, personally held knowledge. He cared about it. She had not known, until this evening, how much he cared about it. She thought, I did not go looking for this. I made myself stop looking. And something came into the space I left. She was careful not to name it more than that. She blew out the lamp and went to sleep, and she told herself firmly that she was not reading anything into this, and mostly she believed it. Edmund did not come to breakfast on the 14th of April. Eleanor had known, since the first month at Calverton, what date the 14th of April was. She had found it in the estate records, in the entries from 4 years ago that noted the staff being given leave, and the house being closed to visitors for 1 week that spring. Mrs. Holt had confirmed it, in her quiet and indirect way, when Eleanor had asked about the week in the estate's history she was looking at. She had not asked Edmund directly, and she had not asked anyone else. She had simply noted the date, and remembered it, and when it arrived, she had made sure, as quietly and as invisibly as she could, that the day's obligations were cleared. No appointments, no meetings with tenants or solicitors or estate managers, no invitations to accept or decline, no requirements of any kind on Edmund's time or attention. She had arranged this without explaining why, and neither Mrs. Holt nor anyone else had asked, because Mrs. Holt was perceptive, and the staff were loyal, and Eleanor had long since established herself as someone who did things for reasons. Edmund disappeared after the early morning, and she did not see him for the whole of the day. She went about her own work quietly, in the library and in the estate office and in the village, where she had a small matter to see to, that could just as easily have waited, but that gave her something to do with the particular quality of her attention that morning, which was careful and a little stretched. She was not worried about Edmund exactly. She simply could not help being aware of the weight of the day and what it carried for him, and awareness was not the same as worry, but it was in the same neighborhood. The afternoon was long. She read for 2 hours in the library and found that the reading was good, and the hours passed more easily than the morning had. She had dinner alone in the small morning room, rather than the formal dining room. She was genuinely tired by 9 in the evening, and nearly went to bed. She was at the door of her rooms, when she happened to look down the corridor toward the east wing, and see the faint, moving light of a lamp through the window at the end of the hall.
The East Terrace.
She stood in the corridor for a moment. She thought about going to bed. She thought about the decision she had made a year and a half ago on the bottom step of a staircase. She thought about what Edmund had said to her mother. She thought about the fact that she had not tried to reach him in all the months since that morning, that she had kept the promise she had made to herself with a consistency she was genuinely proud of. She went to the kitchen. Nell had gone to bed. Eleanor put the kettle on herself and waited for it, while the kitchen was very quiet and the house was very still around her, and she thought about what she was doing and why. She was not trying to reach him. She was not going to the terrace in order to do anything except be present, if he could bear presence, and go back inside immediately if he could not. She was going because she had seen the light in the window, and she had thought, he has been alone with this for a very long time. She was going because she was his wife, and being his wife meant, at the very least, that she was available. She made 2 cups of tea and carried them out to the east terrace. Edmund was sitting on the stone bench at the far end, his coat on against the cold, a glass on the stone beside him that was untouched. He was not looking at anything specific. He was simply sitting in the dark with the night around him, and the Calverton grounds stretching away in every direction, invisible now in the deep April dark. He looked up when he heard the door, and she saw in the lamp she had brought something in his face that was very raw and very tired, the expression of someone who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and has finally put it down just to rest for a moment. She did not say anything about why she was there. She set 1 cup of tea beside him on the stone and sat down at the other end of the bench, a careful distance away, and she did not say anything at all. He did not tell her to go inside. They sat in the dark for a long time. The night was cold, but not bitterly so, and the stars were very clear above the estate, and somewhere in the distance, a fox called once and then went quiet. Eleanor drank her tea slowly and looked at the dark outlines of the trees at the edge of the east field, and did not speak, and did not invite speaking, and did not perform any kind of sympathy. She was simply there. It was the only thing she had decided to offer, and she offered it completely. After a long time, perhaps 40 minutes, Edmund picked up his tea and held it in both hands and looked at it for a moment. Then he said, "She died in the morning." His voice was very quiet and had something in it she had not heard before, something unguarded and very old. Early in the morning, the fever had been 3 days by then. I had been sitting with her all night. She was very calm at the end. She was always calm. That was one of the things about her. Eleanor did not say anything. The house was very quiet afterward, he said. I had not expected the quiet. I had been a soldier. I had been in places where men died, and I had learned to be steady in those moments. I thought I knew something about loss. I did not. I had been wrong, in the particular way you are wrong about something you have not yet actually experienced. A long pause. The quiet went on for a very long time. It is still here, in some ways. He was quiet himself then, for several minutes. She waited. She would have liked you, he said. That is not a comfortable thing to say, but it is true. She was direct and capable, and she did not waste words, and she was not interested in people who performed things. You do not perform things. She would have respected that. Eleanor looked at the dark. It sounds as though she was remarkable, she said. She was, he said, and then, very quietly, I did not know how to continue. After, I managed everything correctly. I did everything I was supposed to do, but the continuing was the wrong shape for a long time. I am not sure it has ever been entirely the right shape since. He stopped speaking. Eleanor did not attempt to finish his sentences or fill the silence with reassurance. She did not try to make him feel better. She simply sat in the dark and let what he had said exist between them, without trying to manage it, or fix it, or turn it into something other than what it was. After a very long time, he turned his head and looked at her. In the dim lamplight, his expression was one she had not seen before on his face, open in a way that was complete rather than accidental. He had not meant to close himself from her this evening. He had simply run out of the energy required for closing. You did not try to fix it, he said. There is nothing to fix, she said. He looked at her for a long moment. She held his gaze without asking anything of it. No, he said quietly. There is not. She stood. She picked up her empty cup and the lamp. She said, "Good night, Edmund." She went inside. She put the cups in the kitchen and went upstairs, and she did not sit at the writing desk, and she did not try to examine what had just happened, or what it meant, or whether it changed anything. She simply went to bed. She lay in the dark in the big Calverton bedroom and listened to the old house settle around her, and she thought, he is outside on that bench, alone with what he has said and what he has not been able to say for 4 years. And she thought, that is where he needs to be. And she thought, I did not try to reach him. I just sat there. And she thought, I do not know what that was. She fell asleep before she had answered the thought, and in the morning, she came down to breakfast, and Edmund was already there, which was unusual, and he said good morning, and she said good morning, and they ate breakfast together, in the quiet that was always their usual quiet. But the quality of it was different. She could not have said precisely how. It was simply different, the way the air was different, before and after rain, both states being air, and yet not the same at all. Something had changed. She knew it, and he knew it, and neither of them said so. They simply sat together in the changed quiet and drank their coffee, and the morning went on around them, and Eleanor thought, I can wait. She was very good at waiting, when the waiting was worth something. Eleanor heard Edmund in the corridor outside the morning room, before she heard him at the door. She was at the writing desk, working through the final correspondence on the amended school agreement, and she heard his footsteps stop in the corridor, and she understood that he was standing at the door and not coming in. She kept writing for a moment. Then she set the pen down and waited. He came to the doorway and stood there. She had known he was there already, and she did not perform surprise when she looked up. She simply looked at him and waited. He looked at her for a long time. He had the expression she had come to recognize as Edmund working something out, not uncertain exactly, but deliberate in the way of someone who was choosing each next thing with care. Something in his face was slightly less contained than usual, as though the work of maintaining the containment was costing him more than it normally did. I said something to your mother, he said, before the wedding, on the morning of the formal announcement. He stopped. He looked at her with the gray, direct, measuring eyes. I believe you may have heard it. The morning room was very quiet. She could hear the fire in the grate and the faint sound of the grounds outside the window, and nothing else. She said, yes. He came into the room. He sat down in the chair across the writing desk from her, the same distance between them as always, the same formal positioning of a conversation that was not yet informal. He put his hands on his knees and looked at them for a moment, and then looked at her. "I said it because I believed it," he said. "I want you to know that. I was not performing honesty. I was not trying to manage expectations in some calculated way. I believed what I said. At the time, it was the truest thing I could have told her. And I told it, because I thought you deserved the truth more than you deserved comfort." "I know," Eleanor said. "I understood that at the time. I also," he said, and paused, and seemed to find the next part more difficult than the first, "believed that it would remain true. That was not a temporary state I was describing. I had been in it for 4 years, and I had no reason to expect it to change." She waited. She had stopped trying to read what he was going to say. She was simply here, in this room, listening to him say things he was clearly finding genuinely difficult to say, which meant they were genuinely true. "What I did not account for," he said, "was you, specifically." She held his gaze. "I have been thinking about this since April," he said, "since the terrace. But I have been thinking about the specific version of this question since considerably before April. Since the day Oliver visited, in fact, though I could not have named it then. Since the morning you resolved the school matter without asking me for help, and thanked me for offering it anyway, without making me feel that the offer had been inadequate." He paused. "Since the library, in your family's house. Since the kitchen garden. Since the dinner, where you said you found honesty more efficient, and I thought, yes, someone who thinks in terms I recognize." Eleanor said nothing. She was listening with the complete attention she gave to things that mattered. "You did not try to reach me," he said. "I had braced myself, coming into this marriage, for someone who would spend the first years attempting to change what I had said was fixed. I had braced for patience, used as a strategy, warmth, used as a lever. I had prepared myself to manage it kindly. You did not do any of those things. You came to Calverton, and you built something of your own that had nothing to do with me, and you were honest with me in every conversation we had, and you never once made me feel that I owed you something I had told you I could not provide." He stopped. He looked at her, with something in his expression that she had only seen once before. For 4 seconds, in an entrance hall nearly 2 years ago. The guard was down, not broken, set aside, deliberately, by his own choice, which was different and considerably rarer. "I cannot tell you that I am capable of what I told your mother I was not capable of," he said. "I do not know yet what I am capable of. I have been closed for a very long time, and I am not certain of all the inventory of what is still inside. But I can tell you that what I said to her in that study is no longer entirely true. Something has changed. I am not going to claim to know precisely what it is or what it will become. I only know that it has changed, and that you are the reason it has changed, and that it seemed dishonest not to tell you." Eleanor looked at his face. The honest, direct, profoundly careful face of Edmund Hartwell, who had decided to tell the truth, even when it was not simple. She said, "I stopped trying to make you feel something. You know that. I made a decision, and I kept it, and I want you to understand that I kept it genuinely. I was not being patient in a strategic way. I stopped trying because I thought it was the honest thing to do. I thought it was what both of us deserved." "I know," he said. "I think that may be exactly why something changed." "What does that mean?" she said. "What do you want to do with this, Edmund?" He reached across the desk and placed his hand on hers. It was the first time he had ever done something like this. Not a formal handshake, not a gesture required by courtesy, but a real and entirely unscripted reach toward her. His hand was large and very warm and very still, and it lay over hers on the surface of the writing desk with the weight of something that had waited a long time to be there. She looked at his hand on hers. She turned her hand over beneath his, palm up, and he felt it, and his hand adjusted and held hers properly, and neither of them said anything for a moment. Then she said, "Whatever you are feeling, and whatever it becomes, I am not going anywhere." He looked at her hand in his. He said, "I know." "Good," she said. They stayed like that for a while. The fire in the grate burned steadily, and the morning room was very quiet, and outside the Calverton grounds were green in the late April light. Eleanor thought, "This is not what I decided when I stood on the bottom step of that staircase. This is not what I was building toward. I was not building toward anything. I stopped building toward anything, and then something arrived into the space I left, and this is what it looks like," she thought. I did not try to make him love me, she thought. I think that is the most important thing. Edmund did not say anything more. He did not need to. He held her hand and she let him, and the morning continued around them in its ordinary, unspectacular, entirely changed way. Edmund said something at breakfast on a Tuesday morning in March, 14 months after the evening on the terrace, that Eleanor had been waiting a year to hear, without ever having said so. He said it without ceremony, in the same even voice he used for all statements of fact, looking at his coffee cup rather than at her. He said, "I slept last night." Eleanor looked at him across the breakfast table. She understood exactly what he meant. She had known, from the first weeks of their marriage, that Edmund rarely slept fully. She had known it from the sound of his footsteps in the corridor before dawn, from the light she sometimes saw under his study door at 3 in the morning, from the fact that he walked in the early dark every morning, for the reason he had told her that morning in the kitchen garden at her family's home, because most nights he could not. She had never pressed him on it. She had never mentioned it. It was simply a fact she held, carefully and without comment, the way she held many facts about Edmund. She reached across the table and placed her hand over his where it rested beside the coffee cup. She did not say anything. He turned his hand over beneath hers and held it for a moment, and then they both returned to their breakfast in the comfortable quiet that had become, over 14 months, simply the texture of their mornings together. She thought about the year that had passed since the April evening on the terrace and the morning room conversation the following week, and about what had happened in between. It had not been a dramatic year. There had been no grand declarations, no single turning points that could be pointed to and named. What there had been was a gradual, careful, deliberate growing toward each other, like two separate and very different plants, given enough room and enough time to find their way toward the same light. Edmund had begun, in the weeks following the morning room conversation, to talk to her more. Not extravagantly. Edmund was never extravagant with words. But he began sharing things that were personal rather than practical, telling her about parts of his history she had not known, about the regiment and the men he had served with, about his father, who had been a formidable and not always kind man. He told her about Catherine in small, careful portions over weeks and months, the way you might share something precious that you are not yet certain can withstand being held by someone else. Eleanor received all of it with the same quality of attention she had given him on the terrace, present and unperforming, neither minimizing what it cost him, nor making too much of what it was giving her. He learned, slowly, and with the focused attention he brought to everything he considered worth understanding, what she was actually like. Not the version of her he had observed from a careful distance. Her, specifically, what she thought about difficult things, what made her genuinely laugh rather than politely smile, what she cared about with the particular intensity that was not visible unless you were paying the right kind of attention. He was very good at paying attention. She had known this from the beginning. She had not known, until he turned it toward her properly and held it there, how different it felt to be the subject of it. There were small things, in that year, that she stored. The evening he came to find her in the library, not because he had a question, but simply because, as he said when she looked up and raised her eyebrows, he had finished what he was doing, and this was where she was. The morning he asked her what she was writing, the first time he had ever asked about something she was doing rather than something the estate required, and listened to the answer with the same focused attention he gave to the land accounts. The afternoon he came back from a difficult meeting with a group of unhappy tenant farmers, and came directly to where she was sitting in the garden, and sat down beside her, and said nothing for 20 minutes, simply sat beside her in the late afternoon light, and she understood that this was something he needed, and she was something that provided it, and she said nothing either, and they sat together until the light changed. There was the morning he was irritated about something that had gone wrong in the northern field management, and came to find her with an expression that was clearly containing something he was not going to say, and she asked him directly what had happened, and he told her, and she gave her honest opinion about it, which was not entirely in his favor, and he looked at her for a long moment, and then said, "You are probably right," and that was the first time he had said so in any of the matters she had given her opinion on, and she understood it to mean something different from an agreement about fields. Oliver Crane visited in June, and spent a long weekend at Calverton, and the difference between this visit and the March visit of the year before was visible within the first hour. He arrived and shook Eleanor's hand, and kissed her cheek with his usual warmth, and then looked at Edmund, and looked at Eleanor, and looked at Edmund again, and said nothing except that it was very good to be back. and his voice had a warmth in it that went beyond the social. On the second evening of the visit, when Eleanor had gone to speak to Mrs. Holt about the following day's arrangements, Oliver said to Edmund, "You look different." Edmund looked at him. "Do I?" he said. "You look like a man who has put something down that he was carrying for a very long time," Oliver said. "It suits you considerably." Edmund said nothing for a moment. Then, "She is very unlike anyone I have ever known." "I know," Oliver said. "I noticed that on the first visit." "She does not try," Edmund said, and his voice had something in it that Oliver had not heard for a very long time. "She does not try to manage me, or fix me, or wait for me to become something I have not told her I am. She simply exists, inside this house, completely herself, and it turns out that is the one thing I could not build a wall against." Oliver looked at his friend for a long moment. "Well," he said, "good." George Whitmore came in the autumn, and the reunion was the same, and entirely different. Edmund laughed 3 times in the first 2 hours. Not the careful, brief, contained laugh he had always managed, but the real one. The one with the whole face. The one Eleanor had seen for 4 seconds in an entrance hall nearly 3 years ago, and had been, without knowing it, waiting to see again properly. George caught her eye across the room the first time it happened, and she saw in his expression a complicated mixture of relief and satisfaction, and something very close to gratitude. Later that evening, while Edmund was occupied elsewhere, George found Eleanor in the library and said, "I have known him since we were 10 years old, and I have been wanting for 4 years to see him laugh like that again." She looked at him. "I did not do anything," she said. "That is the strange truth of it. I stopped doing things. Something came in when I stopped." George said, "I think that was always what he needed. Someone who stopped. Someone who let him find his own way back." He paused. "Not everyone would have had the patience for that." "I am stubborn," she said. "I mentioned that to you once." "You did," he said, smiling. "I thought you were understating it. I was right." Clara came to Calverton in the autumn too, for her first proper visit, and she arrived with the bright, focused energy of someone who had been composing opinions about everything she was about to see for 3 years, and was finally in a position to form them directly. She was 20 years old now, and had lost none of the enthusiasm, and gained a considerable amount of the perceptiveness that Eleanor had always suspected was under it. She spent the first day exploring the hall and the grounds, and asking Mrs. Holt questions, that Mrs. Holt answered with an accuracy and patience that spoke to a genuine respect for Clara's inquiries. On the second day, Clara found Eleanor in the library, and sat across from her and said, "He is not who I expected." "No," Eleanor agreed. "He is quieter," Clara said. "I expected quiet. But not this kind. This is not the quiet of someone who is absent. It is the quiet of someone who is very much present, and simply does not waste it." Eleanor smiled. "You noticed." "I notice everything," Clara said. "You taught me to." She leaned back in her chair. "He looks at you the same way you look at an interesting problem. As though you are something he is genuinely trying to understand, and genuinely finds worth the effort." She paused. "I think he is in love with you, Eleanor." "I do not think he has said that." "Not in those words," Eleanor said. "But in other ways?" Eleanor thought about the hand on hers across the writing desk, about the morning he had told her he slept, about the evening he had stayed in the library until midnight simply because she was there, both of them reading in the particular comfortable silence that was theirs, and no one else's. She thought about the way he had asked, 2 months ago, whether she was happy at Calverton, and how the asking of it had been the most direct personal question he had ever put to her, and how she had said yes, genuinely, and how he had looked at her for a long moment and said, "Good. Just that, good." "In other ways," she said. "Entirely in other ways." In the spring of the following year, Edmund and Eleanor walked the southern boundary of the Calverton estate, on a morning that was the first properly warm morning of the season, the kind of morning that meant something specific, after a long winter. The fields were just beginning to green, and the sky was a clear, pale blue, and the air had warmth in it that was real rather than provisional. They walked slowly, and talked about things that had nothing important and everything real about them. The southern fields drainage issue, which had a straightforward solution they had discussed before. A book Eleanor was reading that Edmund had read 10 years ago and had opinions about. Something Clara had written in her last letter that had made Eleanor laugh out loud at the breakfast table. and which she recounted with the easy pleasure of someone sharing something good. Edmund listened to all of it with his full and genuine attention. He said things that were precise and occasionally funny. He walked beside her at the particular distance that was their distance, close enough to be together and with enough space between them for two whole people. Once, when Eleanor's boot caught on a tuft of frost-heaved ground, and she stumbled very slightly, his hand was at her elbow before she had fully registered what had happened, and she felt the warmth of it through her sleeve, and said thank you, and he said nothing, just walked on with her, and it was entirely ordinary, and entirely everything. Years later, when people asked Eleanor Hartwell how she and Edmund had found their way to each other, she would pause for a moment, in the particular way she always paused, when a question deserved a real answer rather than a comfortable one. She would look at them with her clear, direct gaze, and she would say, simply, "I stopped trying to make him love me." I think that was what finally gave him room to. People sometimes found this unsatisfying because it sounded like a paradox rather than an explanation. They expected something warmer or more particular, some single moment that could be pointed to. She never gave them that, because it was not how it had happened. It had happened the way a season changed, gradually, without announcement, over the course of a very long time, with the specific, unhurried certainty of things that grow when they are given enough space and enough honesty to grow in. What she did not say, because it did not belong to anyone but herself, was the rest of it. That stopping had been the hardest thing she had ever done, not because the trying had been easy, but because it had been hope, and choosing to put down a hope is always harder than losing it involuntarily. That she had stood on the bottom step of a staircase in her family's house on a cold morning and heard the words that ended one set of expectations, and had then, quietly and without witnesses, made the decision that had made everything else possible. That the decision had not been noble or strategic. It had simply been honest. Just that, honest. She did not say these things. She kept them folded carefully, the way she had always kept the things that mattered, inside the life she had built. The particular, quiet, genuine life at Calverton Hall, with the man who had come back to himself slowly and on his own terms, and who had found, when he finally arrived, that she was there. Not waiting, not reaching, just there. The way she had always been,